The War of the Heavenly Horses was a conflict in which a bunch of Greek colonists came to blows with Han Dynasty China over a bunch of horses in what is now Uzbekistan. Now, I know that this setup might sound completely random at first, with some of you asking why did this even happen, why are there Greek colonists in Central Asia, and why are they fighting with China over a bunch of horses? Well, that's what this video is going to be about. Though as usual with me and my channel, I'm not going to talk about the strategy and warfare part of the war, but rather I'll be talking about how and why this war came to be and its aftermath. But to explain that, I first have to give you some background to get you caught up. Our main sources of this conflict come primarily from the records of the Grand Historian by the famous historian Zhang Qian and the two books of Han, which gives us some background to how this war came about. But I'll begin much further back to give you an even bigger picture. So to begin, I'll start off by introducing our two main players, the Greco-Bactrian Kingdom and Han Dynasty China. I'll start with the latter first. So back during the Hellenistic era, Iran and parts of Central Asia were ruled by the Seleucid Empire, one of the major Hellenistic states to emerge after the death of Alexander the Great. But by around 255, the satrap of Bactria, one of the eastmost regions, declared himself king, thus establishing his own kingdom. Despite its distance, the kingdom retained contact with the rest of the Mediterranean world and was noted for its highly urbanized cities and sophisticated Hellenistic culture. Remember how I mentioned in my previous video that during this period a large number of Greeks had migrated eastward to Asia? Well, funnily enough, even before Alexander's conquest, there were already a number of Greeks living in the region of Bactria. Back during the reign of the Achaemenids, Greeks who lived in the west of Anatolia, like the Ionians, who had revolted against the Persians, ended up being displaced and moved to faraway regions such as Bactria as punishment. Anyway, by around 170, the Greco-Bactrian Kingdom would reach its greatest extent. In the north, it included the regions of Sogdiana and Ferghana, the latter of which is going to play a major role in this story. The kingdom even extended into northwest India, which led to many Greeks being introduced to Buddhism. This Indian territory would later become known as the Indo-Greek Kingdom. Bactria became renowned throughout the ancient world for its large and wealthy cities, even being nicknamed the Land of 1,000 Cities. Greek was the kingdom's official language, but it was still spoken alongside the local ones like Bactrian, Sogdian, Parthian, and Sanskrit. But problems for Bactria began to emerge in 165 BC when King Mithridates the Great came to power in Parthia. The Parthians, much like Bactria, also had previously split off from the Seleucids, and by 148 their kingdom had evolved into a large empire which cut off Bactria from the rest of the Hellenistic world, even taking some of their western territories. So that's how the Greco-Bactrian Kingdom came to be and was positioned by around 130 BC. But now let's stop here and jump back in time and talk about our other player. Since 202 BC, China had been ruled by the Han Dynasty, whose rule is often considered a golden age in Imperial Chinese history, even overseeing periods of economic prosperity. However, they had one big problem during their early years, which was how to deal with their northern neighbor. This northern neighbor was the Xiongnu, a confederation of various nomadic groups of people who'd often raid across China's northern border. The Xiongnu, much like other nomadic empires, specialized in horseback archery, which was something that the Han army wasn't really equipped to deal with. So to keep them at bay, the Han adopted a policy called Heqin, wherein the Han would marry off noble women to the leader of the Xiongnu and send goods like silk and food as tribute. In return, the Xiongnu would pinky promise to stop with all the raiding and pillaging. Despite this rather lopsided agreement, there were some Xiongnu subordinates who still continued to raid along the border. However, in 138 BC, during the reign of Emperor Han Wudi, the Han got their hands on some interesting intel. They discovered that the previous enemies of the Xiongnu, the Yuezhi, were still alive and were not wiped out as they had originally thought. The Yuezhi were a group of nomads, much like the Xiongnu, who once used to neighbor them in the west. But after suffering a major defeat from them, they were forced to migrate westward. So Emperor Wudi came up with a plan. He planned to track down the Yuezhi, forge an alliance with them, and together defeat the Xiongnu. But one problem. They didn't know where exactly they were located, so the emperor appointed an official named Zhang Qian to go west and track down the Yuezhi. This task shouldn't be too difficult for you. After all you have to do is go across the Xiongnu-controlled Gobi Desert and find a group of nomads whose exact location is anybody's guess. So you know, no pressure. In 138 BC, Zhang Qian and his entourage began their journey and were immediately captured by the Xiongnu. For 30 years he was held as a prisoner but managed to escape and continue his mission. By around 130 BC, Zhang Qian finally reached the Greco-Bactrian Kingdom, or at least what remained of it. Because you see, a few years earlier, after the Yuezhi were forced to move westward, they came into conflict with the Wusun and Saka people, defeating both of them, driving out the latter from the Ili River Valley and taking their place, thus leading the Saka to move southwards and invade the region of Sogdiana. Later, in 132 BC, the Wusun, with the support of the Xiongnu, came back for revenge and kicked out the Yuezhi from the valley. So now, just like the Saka, they also invaded the Bactrian Kingdom. Because of their previous defeats against the Parthians, the Greco-Bactrian Kingdom was left too weak to resist these nomadic invasions, with King Heliocles leaving Bactria and moving his capital to the Kabul Valley in 130 BC, thus making him the last king to rule in the Bactrian country. So by the time Zhang Qian reached Ferghana, or Daiyuan as the Chinese sources called it, the Greco-Bactrian Kingdom had already begun to fragment into a bunch of independent cities, with Ferghana at this point being under the control of the Saka, who likely had established themselves as the ruling aristocracy of the region, governing over a majority Hellenized population. During his stay, Zhang Qian noted how the people lived in walled cities, grew rice and wheat, and used grapes to make wine. But something else that caught his attention were their horses. He noted how sturdy and powerful these Ferghana horses were, but most interestingly, he noted how they sweated blood. Zhang Qian would also later visit the regions of Sogdiana and Bactria until he finally tracked down the Yuezhi, but didn't succeed in forging an alliance with them since they had no interest in getting revenge against the Xiongnu. After returning to China, he reported everything he saw to the emperor, who was particularly intrigued by these blood-sweating horses. According to the Shiji, the emperor had earlier read a divination from the Book of Changes, which foretold the arrival of divine horses from the northwest. At first he thought it was referring to the horses of the Wusun people, but after hearing about these horses from Daoyuan, he was convinced that they were the real divine horses, and thus dubbing them heavenly horses. So Emperor Wudi came up with a new plan, which was to go and get some of these heavenly horses for himself to bolster his own cavalry and use them to defeat the Xiongnu. For the next few years, Ferghana and China would exchange multiple envoys, but relations between the two were already somewhat uneasy. Because of how far away Daoyuan was from China and its army, their envoys acted with great arrogance, knowing that they were out of range from retaliation and did not comply to proper Han rituals. Meanwhile, the envoys sent by the Han were often treated poorly. Because the people of Daoyuan highly valued Chinese goods, they didn't let the envoys buy food unless they handed over their goods, and even charged them exorbitant fees wherever they went. Many of the Han envoys came from poorer families and fought to make a fortune by buying cheap products in foreign lands and then make a killing back in China. Instead, many of them were left in a state of destitution, and with tensions rising, in some cases they even started fighting each other. At some point, the emperor sent a trade mission with 1,000 pieces of gold and a golden horse statue to purchase these heavenly horses. But the people of Daoyuan refused, arguing that their horses were one of their country's most valuable treasures. They told the mission, quote, "The Han is far away from us and on several occasions has lost men in the saltwater wastes between our country and China. Yet if the Han parties go further north, they will be harassed by the Xiongnu, while if they try to go south, they will suffer from lack of water and fodder. Moreover, there are many places along the route where there are no cities whatsoever, and they are apt to run out of provisions. The Han embassies that have come to us are made up of only a few hundred men, and yet they are always short of food, and over half of the men die on the journey. Under such circumstances, how could the Han possibly send a large army against us? What have we to worry about? Furthermore, the horses of Ershi are one of the most valuable treasures of the state." The Han envoys, offended by this statement, threw the golden horse to the ground out of anger, breaking it. The people of Daoyuan, offended by this reaction, killed the Han envoys and confiscated all of their goods. As you can imagine, Emperor Wu Di wasn't happy hearing about this, and sent General Li Guanli to lead a punitive expedition to get those horses through force. The first expedition began in 104 BC and it was a complete failure. Because of the distance and them besieging every single oasis city along the route that refused to give them supplies, the army ended up exhausted and was reduced to starvation by the time they neared Dayuan. Li had already lost too many men to continue the campaign, and after suffering a defeat at Yucheng, he returned to China. The members of the court tried to convince Wu Di to give up on the campaign and disband Li's army so they can refocus their resources on fighting the Xiongnu directly. But the emperor refused, fearing that giving up might cause the Han Empire to lose face. So during his second attempt, he didn't take any chances and sent off Li with an even bigger army. This time, the sheer size of the new army was enough to subdue most of the oasis cities along the route, until they reached the capital of Ferghana, the city of Urshi, also known as Alexandria Escate, though when they arrived the army had already dwindled to half due to many of the soldiers deserting. After all, most of them were just levies. Anyway, once there, Li immediately besieged the city. After a 40-day-long siege and the Han diverging the river from passing through the city, thus cutting its water supply, they finally managed to break through the outer walls, leading to the nobles to move within the inner walls for shelter. The Dayuan nobles, tired of this siege, decided to offer terms of surrender to the Han army. So they decided to kill their ruler, King Wugua, and send his decapitated head to Li, and offered all the horses he wanted and have him end the siege in return. Li accepted these terms, but before leaving with the horses, he installed a local noble named Meikai as the king, since he was one of the few people in Dayuan to treat the Han envoys well. After a quick side trip to conquer the city of Yucheng, the Han army had finally won the war in 101 BC, taking around 3,000 of the heavenly horses back home. So, what happened in the war's aftermath? Well, just a year later, King Meikai was killed by the nobles who blamed him for this whole affair and replaced him with the brother of King Wugua, Changfeng. The new king, however, wanted to keep good relations with China, so he sent his son as a hostage. The Han accepted and even sent him gifts, finally making peace with Dayuan. Weirdly, the Han didn't seem to have been upset over the murder of King Meikai, despite being the ones installing him as ruler. Because of this display of power, many of the Tocharian oasis cities along the Tarim Basin declared their fealty to the Han. This would down the line lead to the creation of the Protectorate of the Western Regions, establishing Chinese influence over Central Asia. China would send embassies to places like Parthia, Mesopotamia, India, and even Seleucid Syria. These connections would lead to the establishment of what would become known as the Silk Road, which is how Chinese goods like silk ended up being traded all the way to the Roman Empire, or how Buddhism would be introduced to China from India through Central Asia. While the War of the Heavenly Horses may not be as famous as many other ancient wars, it's definitely one of the most fascinating events in the ancient world in my opinion, because 1. It shows how interconnected the ancient world really was, despite how it is sometimes portrayed or may come off to some. And 2. It kicked off the establishment of the Silk Road, which would lead to some of the biggest cultural exchanges in all of history. Also, the concept of ancient Greeks fighting against Han Chinese is a pretty wild setup, and it sounds almost fake out of context. Thank you for watching. This video was hard for me to make due to real life things going on as usual and me trying to decide what to include because there was so much stuff happening before this war even began. As I have mentioned previously, I have a merch store now. As of now, I only have very basic stickers, but you have to start somewhere. If you're interested, you can go click the link in the description or click the link in the pinned comment down below. Anyway, see you next time, whenever that is.